I'm going to get the plug out of the way first. We've got a new podcast. It's called Stuff Matters with me, Ed Conway. The idea behind it is that in each episode, we take an object, like an everyday object, something that you have around you, and we try to delve down the rabbit hole of, where's it come from, how's it made, and also what are the lessons that we can learn about our lives. I think it's quite interesting. I think you'll like it. And what I've got here is a bit of a screen sneak preview showing you some of the stuff, also some charts, because podcasts don't tend to have charts for obvious reasons. And the first object we are looking at is the LED bulb. And I know that sounds random. Many of these objects initially would sound random, but I'm going to show you why it's not. And it comes back to the fact that human history is in some ways a story of how we have generated more light for less money. If you think about the Dark Ages, well, what were they? They were dark. It was very expensive to light the world. We had fires, you had some candles, but the cost of light used to be really high. And what this chart is showing you is a modelled version of how much it cost to light a home. And in this case, I've just taken 5 60-watt bulbs and just worked out, the cost of that. And you can see how in the era of candles and lamps, it was very high. And then it came down and down and down as we got kind of better at making these technologies, down even further in the era of kind of gas and kerosene lamps, and then down to basically what looks like close to zero in the era of electricity. And just to give you a sense of what we're talking about here, if you kind of look up here in the kind of 1300s, 1400s, so kind of, medieval period, Middle Ages then, the cost of lighting your average home was, and this is inflation adjusted obviously, was enormously high, £35,000. Think about that, just to get the same amount of light that, is kind of an all right amount of light these days, £35,000. No one could afford it. And then over time, that went down and down and down to you get to here, in the 1900s, electricity starting to become more popular, light bulbs, Thomas Edison, all of that, and it's down to kind of £260. And roll on to where we are today with LED bulbs, we'll get onto that in a second, it's literally £2. So you can see, being able to light the world more cheaply made a massive difference. Everything could change. You could actually read books after dark, which people couldn't do back here. And the latest chapter in this story is about LEDs, light-emitting diodes. It's an amazing technology. But initially, when LEDs were invented, which was kind of middle of the 20th century, it's kind of silicon technology. They could only do red and green LEDs, which was all very well. But if you want to make the full colours of the spectrum and create white LEDs, in other words, something that's kind of equivalent to a light bulb, you also need blue. And the challenge of being able to try and work out how to create the crystalline structure enabling you to make a blue LED, it turns out that was incredibly difficult. And it was eventually cracked by these 3 scientists, all of them from Japan, who eventually were awarded the Nobel Prize in physics in 2014. This is Shuji Nakamura. We spoke to him for the episode, so another reason why you should definitely listen to it. And at the time, the Nobel Committee said, by inventing the blue LED, they were basically helping to save the world's resources. We'll get on to whether that is indeed the case in a moment, but worth just saying, part of the reason, this is showing you different types of light bulbs and their adoption over time. And you'll probably remember, up until quite recently, governments were really trying to encourage people to use fluorescent lights, OK? Things like that, fluorescent light bulbs. But they're just basically rubbish, weren't they? And they were nothing like as good as incandescent bulbs. And there was this long period where everyone was being encouraged to buy these things, and they kind of wanted to stick with those bulbs. Then along came LEDs. That blue LED was invented. They kind of therefore were able to create proper LED bulbs. And just look at what happened. Out of nowhere, this new technology overtook pretty much everything else. This is what happened in India, but similar story in other countries around the world. And why did that happen? Well, in part, it's because LEDs are just so much better than those old fluorescent types of bulbs. And let me show you kind of one example of this. It comes back to something, a slightly obscure statistic, I'll admit, one I'm kind of a bit fixated with, which is called the colour rendering index. And basically, the idea here is to say that imagine that daylight is 100% of all of the spectrums of the rainbow, the colours of the rainbow. Incandescent bulbs are able to replicate all of those colours when you light a room with an incandescent bulb, old-fashioned type of bulb. But, look over here, cool white fluorescents, sodium lamps, those old-school bulbs were just rubbish at it. So you light the room and it just doesn't look as good. It's much cooler, and you just, more importantly, don't get all of the colours. So you've got this kind of uncanny sense in there. Well, the thing about LEDs, not all of them, but they are, for the most part, much, much better than those old kind of efficient bulbs at creating full spectrum light. So that when you light up the room, it actually feels like it's lit up, almost like an old school light bulb. Worth just saying, even the most ultra-high colour CRI bulbs, as they're called, which are quite expensive, they're still not quite at 100% of what the incandescent can produce. But even so, they are much, much better. And so that's part of the reason why people were like, OK, this is quite a good technology. And then the other reason is that they are so much more efficient. And what this is showing you, so think about old school ways of lighting up the world, oil lamps and also those incandescent bulbs. Most of the energy you put in is wasted in the form of heat. That's obvious when it comes to fires and oil lamps. But incandescent bulbs, you know if you've held one of them how hot they run. Whereas with LEDs, you put in a certain amount of energy and the vast amount of it gets turned straight into light. So they are so much more efficient. And this is what the Nobel Committee were talking about when they awarded that prize. It was like, you're going to help save the world because this is so much more efficient. So much less energy gets produced, so much less carbon emissions at the same time. And actually, another way of looking at the same thing is, this is the efficiency of light over time. And think back to that chart we showed just at the start. It's got cheaper and it's got more efficient. We've got better at lighting the world, which is transformational. And on top of that, you haven't just got energy efficiency, they are so much cheaper, or they've become cheaper over time. And we've seen this phenomenon, you'll have seen this before, this idea that over time, it's known as learning curves. Over time, our ability to make stuff means they get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And this is showing you solar panels and how they've got cheaper over time. It's an exponential chart. So a better way of showing this is to use a logarithmic scale. This is one for the data nerds here, but basically showing you the same thing. Cheaper, 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 cheaper since the 1970s. Well, what do we get if we look at the same thing for LEDs? It's basically the same story. They have got cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And this is what brings me to the interesting kind of turning point here, which is there was someone a long time ago who said, OK, if something gets cheaper and more available and more efficient, what are the chances we just end up using a lot more of it? And that man was someone called William Stanley Jevons. This is back in the Victorian era, very early economist. You can see there he is with a beard, and famous for a few other things as well. But he wrote this book called The Coal Question. And the idea behind the coal question was, in the Industrial Revolution, even as our steam engines got more and more efficient, it wasn't like we kind of just kept, we didn't burn as much coal because the machines were better. We just kept burning more and more coal. And he at the time was worried that we were burning so much coal. This is a chart from the actual book, by the way. We were burning so much coal, I'll zoom in on it so you can just see, so much coal that over time our coal consumption would go straight into the stratosphere and we would basically run out of coal. That was the idea of the Jevons paradox as it became known. And that obviously that didn't happen. But here's what's kind of interesting about it. So I've just recreated that chart. This is Jevons saying, look, we're going to run out of coal because we're going to use more and more coal. And this is my projection. If we carry on using coal at the rate we are right now, we're going to run out of this stuff. In the event, what actually happened is this. So coal consumption kind of went down partly because we imported a lot of the stuff, but partly also because it wasn't just about coal. Eventually it was about gas, it was about nuclear, it was about other sources of energy. So in one important respect, Jevons was wrong about coal. But what happens if you take all of the different types of energy we're using and work out how they have evolved over time? What you see is a line that looks a bit like this. And in this respect, Jevons actually was kind of bang on. Our total energy consumption has gone up at a stratospheric rate. And that has a bearing on this LED light bulb issue I want to talk about. And a really good way of illustrating the Jevons paradox, as it's known, with LEDs, is to think about the headlights, the bulbs in car headlights. Now, this is an old school car headlight. If you look really close, that is like a halogen bulb. So that's the way that we used to, up until relatively recently, we used to make these headlights work. And halogen bulbs, they use quite a lot of power, about 110 watts. And if you wanted to replace a regular halogen bulb with an LED, remember, because they're much more efficient, that's the amount of power that they consume. So it's about 70% down. So that's amazing, isn't it? But here's where we come back to the Jevons paradox. What if, instead of just taking the bulbs that they had in the past and recreating them with LEDs, people decided, no, we want nicer, more clever bulbs. We want loads of LEDs. And that's kind of what's happened, because the most up-to-date headlights you can get these days, they are, first of all, brighter than the old school halogen bulbs. But also they have these things like matrix LEDs. You might have seen this. The latest cars, top-of-the-range lights, you've got these special bulbs where you've got multiple LEDs, and what they do is they basically, they make one area of the street dark so you're not blinding incoming traffic. Matrix LEDs, fantastic technology, but here's the downside with them. So back to that chart before, they consume more power than the standard LED. You see? And then there's even, these days, the state of the art when it comes to headlights is what's known as projection headlamps, which can consume even more. And this, basically, when it comes to LEDs and headlights, is the Jevons paradox. Instead of just banking all of the savings we make with efficiency, which is what would have happened, we're coming up with new clever things to do with those bulbs. We're using more of them. We're consuming more of them. That seems to be human nature. And so if you look back over the course of history and look at how much light we had, if you're kind of assuming that all of these new technologies are great and that we save the world thanks to them, then you'd assume that the amount of light that we're producing would stay low. But instead, the amount of light that we have consumed, this is the extent to which we have lit the world, it's just gone up and up and up and up. And if you look at the total energy consumption as a result of all that light, that has gone up. It dipped back down when electric bulbs came along because they are much more efficient than the old school gas lamps. But then look at what happened afterwards. It went up and up and up. And here is the interesting point now, because LEDs have come along and you can see that line has started to tip down a bit. And the question we're faced with right now at this moment is, are we in that moment, like when electricity came along and all of a sudden we started to use less power because we were lighting up the world but not having quite as much light as we might have otherwise had? Or are we in a totally new paradigm? And we just don't know the answer. But Jevons would suggest that potentially there could be a sting in the tail. And the example I like to think of when it comes to this, it's not just car headlights, it's this building here. This is the Sphere in Las Vegas, an entire building which is enrobed in LEDs. You simply couldn't have had this before because the technology just wasn't there. But that might just be an example of how we've come up with all sorts of new uses for LEDs. Final thing I'll leave you with, because I'm conscious this is kind of relatively long. The reason this matters, so I started with a chart just showing you total cost of lighting over time. Worth just noting, it used to be, back in the late Victorian period, that nearly all of our power went in to light. And we basically had no room for anything else. Light was everything. Power was light. These days, partly because light has got so much more efficient, it only consumes about 6% of all of our power. And that means there is basically more room for doing other stuff. And the promise of LEDs is they make it so much cheaper to have light and so much more efficient that maybe we can do even more other stuff. The question mark is whether we're going to be stung by the Jevons paradox all over again. So there is much more on that in this new podcast, Stuff Matters, and we will have new objects to talk about in the coming weeks as well.